Imagine a glittering ball, a carefully crafted jewel woven from a multitude of chains, pearl threads, and shimmering spirals, studded with beads and crystals of all possible shades of happiness and joy. Now enlarge the orb to the size of a small star, and populate it with billions of intelligent beings, enliven it with huge parks and inland seas, and connect the vast living spaces with spacious air corridors, which are easily traveled by the inhabitants of the jewel and guests who came from all corners of the galaxy. If you haven't succeeded, don't worry. For someone who has never seen Xanadu, it's hard to imagine an artificial structure of this scale created for a singular purpose: the worship of beauty and art. The Vayons who built Xanadu left the galaxy long ago, though no one knows for sure when they did so, how, or why. Some believe that they disappeared, dissolved into the universe, after reaching the collective catharsis when they summoned Xanadu from oblivion by the will of their creative imagination. But this is only speculation. One thing is certain: Xanadu was their greatest legacy to all intelligent civilizations of the galaxy, and only a man of art can get to Xanadu. But once there, you will unlikely ever leave this incredible world, a utopia of true creativity. Yuri Foss had never been more worried in his life than he had been in the last few hours. Not since the moment the Sixth Union's inter-system ship, Awareness Space, came out of hyperspace into direct teleport range. To get to Xanadu, and not just as a trivial tourist, but to visit this legendary place during the festival. The ticket cost a lot of money, and even more effort just to get it. You couldn't get tickets to the festival in the mall next door. As a result, Yuri was almost bankrupt, but that was nothing compared to the opportunity to attend the festival. And it did not matter that this time the festival was not quite in line with Yuri's work. These events did not take place often. Yuri remembered only one festival 40 years ago when he had just started attending art school. And now it's coming. A new festival, a grand event, which will bring together millions of the best dancers from all known worlds. The best of the best from every corner of the galaxy. In fact, the festival has already begun. All halls, parks, stadiums, and spaces suitable for public entertainment had been given over to solo and group dance performances, including huge troupes, the likes of which no one in the human worlds could even imagine. Yuri remembered that he had heard about one dance company of the insectoid race Shext, which consisted of 200,000 dancers. A special place was set aside for them between the living branches of the Xanadu. A vast space was enclosed in a shell of force fields, and the vacuum in it was displaced by air. Beautiful swarms of dancers performed incredibly graceful pirouettes to infrasound music, creating the complex pattern of jeweled bodies and fluttering pearlescent wings. Of course, all the performances were broadcast for everyone to see. Any of Xanadu's residents and visitors could watch them by connecting their neural shunt to one of the many channels of the info network, and any of the audience could vote for their favorite dancer or troupe. There were no juries or complicated counting systems. Whoever got the most votes was the winner. The system seemed deceptively simple to the point of unreliability, but never once failed. The winner of all festivals was always a genius. However, this festival had one peculiarity. Almost everyone was sure in advance who would be the winner, because the great Nartaka himself was to arrive at the festival. The legendary mysterious dancer, whose performances had changed the lives of entire civilizations, even those with no inclination to romantic impulses. Those who treated the art as something utilitarian, Xanadu as a waste of resources, and its population as a crowd of idlers. And yet, after Nartaka's tour, These races suddenly developed a penchant for the beautiful, and one cybernetic civilization even set out to transform a neighboring globular cluster, following its newfound sense of harmony. Of course, the recordings of Nartaka's performances were sold in gigantic quantities, but all those who personally attended them were unanimous. The recordings do not convey even 1/100th of the impressions of the dance. Critics and choreographers repeatedly argued about the secrets of his mastery, dissertations, and monographs proliferated by the dozens, but he just kept dancing. Or she, or maybe even it. No one knew if Nartaka was a man, a woman, or something totally indefinable. In fact, no one knew even what race he belonged to. What was known was that his appearance could change significantly from performance to performance. It was possible with the modern level of cosmetic medicine, but many people claimed that Nartaka could change his appearance even while dancing, which was unbelievable. But many things about Nartaka seemed unbelievable. A subtle melodic tinkle informed the line of shuffling passengers that the teleporters were ready to begin departing for Xanadu Reception Terminal A5, the closest to the festival's main arenas. The stewards removed the barrier tape, and passengers began to enter the cabins that could teleport 2 persons simultaneously. Yuri was paired with a tall, swarthy man, a completely ordinary man without any additions or changes, but taller than Yuri by a head and of a very athletic build. The man intercepted Yuri's curious gaze and smiled warmly in response to the art historian's embarrassed smile. "It's okay, buddy," the tall man said. "I'm used to the curiosity of others. I'm a pretty big boy, even by my family's standards, and the Gambinos were always taller than average. My name is Eric Gambino, a specialist in, exotic arts." And he held out a large hand for a handshake. Yuri shook it fearfully, afraid that the big man would break his fingers, but Eric was apparently quite capable of controlling his strength, and the handshake was nothing more than a friendly, firm shake. Yuri Foss, art historian, specializing in Third Empire and Aldebaran Alliance paintings from the Great Transition. Gambino shook his head respectfully. "A fascinating period. I've always wanted to learn more about it, but I just haven't had, the time. But tell me, how do you study Aldebaran painting? Did you change your eyesight?" The Aldebarans, a humanoid race self-destroyed in internal wars more than 200 standard years ago, had the vision, and thus painting, heavily skewed toward the violet part of the spectrum. "I have implants," Yuri said. It was a question he'd heard countless times before, but he was pleased by the big man's interest and obliged to give a proper answer. "Aldebaran vision is, how should I put it, too specific to live with all the time, so I got the nano implants. They are not working constantly. I can turn them off and on whenever I want to." Gambino nodded. "I see. I too sometimes have to deal with, similar problems." Yuri wanted to ask what kind of problems a specialist in exotic arts might encounter and what kind of arts they were, but it was their turn to teleport. They stepped into the cabin, and a moment later, Xanadu welcomed them into a glittering embrace. Can you imagine a world that embodies absolute beauty? A world in which everything is pleasing to the eye. A world so beautiful that any intelligent being, whether human, humanoid, or any imaginable species, seems to be utterly devoid of any flaws while being in it. Becomes the ideal of its race, although it does not lose its individuality. They say that beauty standards vary from race to race, but Xanadu accommodates them all at once, bringing them together unfathomably into one harmonious whole. Impossible, you say? But neither is Xanadu, and yet here it is. Yuri had seen many masterpieces, but for the first time in his life, he was inside a masterpiece, the greatest he had ever seen, and certainly he had never dreamed of being a part of it. The most incredible feature of Xanadu was that by some miracle, any of its inhabitants, tourists, their luggage, and even trash, became part of the universal harmony of beauty. Yuri looked at his traveling companion and marveled at how much the big fellow had become like a god. Gambino winked. First time on Xanadu, buddy? Yeah, it's a lot to get used to. It's my third time here, and I still can't get used to it. Just a few moments ago, on the ship, you were just an ordinary man. No offense, buddy, right? And now I'm standing next to the most beautiful and wise art historian in the universe. Those Vayons knew what they were doing. They really were. Yuri shook his head as if trying to banish the illusion. But it stayed. This was all real. He's on Xanadu. He thought about the several collections he had dreamed of visiting. All the best art collections were located on Xanadu, and if any were left elsewhere, it was only through ignorance, oversight, or the naive stubbornness of the owners. He thought of the inhabitants of Xanadu, with whom he dreamed of communicating in person rather than through hyperlinks, art historians, painters, and sculptors. He remembered about the festival. Nartaka, he blurted out, but came to his senses immediately. I'm sorry, it just slipped out. You said this is your third visit to Xanadu? Then you must know how to navigate in this place. How do you get to the main festival hall? I have a ticket for tonight's performance of Nartaka. Gambino smiled broadly. Buddy, this is not some crowded merchant station. This is Xanadu. Just go into the teleporter booth. No, not that one. Those are for communicating with ships only. The inner ones are over there. So, you go into the booth and tell it your desired destination. You don't even have to say it out loud. Just make it clear in your mind. Wait. Let's make it simpler. I'll keep you company. As it happens, I also have a ticket. And Gambino gestured at the row of teleport booths, which looked like shimmering diamond jewelry. Yuri thought that these exotic arts seemed to bring in a good income judging by the careless ticket Gambino had dropped. He had to sell his house on the Martian Riviera for his ticket. However, there was no time. It was only half an hour before Nartaka's performance will start. Like everything on Xanadu, the main festival hall was a work of art. From the circular stage in the middle, the bleachers spread out in a circular amphitheater, gradually becoming a giant hemisphere that converged somewhere in the sky. The hall had a capacity of 200,000 visitors. Although the farthest seats were nearly half a mile from the stage, special warp devices allowed each spectator to see and hear what was going on as if he were sitting in the front row. Special sectors were set up for races whose breathing and lifestyles were critically out of sync with oxygen species. Yuri parted ways with Eric Gambino at the entrance to the hall. Their seats were far apart, although there was no fundamental difference in where to sit. Tickets to the front row and the top of the hemisphere cost almost the same. Gambino shook hands once again and promised to find Yuri after the show. It's easy, he said. It's about the same as using a teleporter. Just imagine the person you want, and the mini-guide will tell you where to go. And if the person doesn't want to be found? Yuri asked. Gambino smirked. Then it won't, he said. But this is Xanadu. No one hides here. We'll see you later. I hope Nartaka's performance goes without, surprises. And before Yuri could ask what surprises he meant, Gambino disappeared into the thick and colorful crowd of spectators. Yuri had expected the hall to buzz with so many people, but it was surprisingly quiet. Apparently, the warp field had also muffled the noise. As soon as he had gotten comfortable in his chair and marveled at the clear view of the stage, as clear as the front row, he heard a soft, gentle sound, and the lights in the auditorium began to go out, leaving only the stage flooded with sparkling light. At first, the sound was hushed, literally on the verge of being audible, but the volume gradually increased until the sound began to suggest a magical, iridescent melody, long and pulsating. Yuri knew that not all intelligent races perceived sound similarly, but he was sure Xanadu's magical equipment adjusted to each spectator. Moreover, he would not be surprised if he found out that they even heard different melodies according to the preferences of each race. The melody evolved, became more complex, and was enhanced by the lighting's whimsical play of color and brightness. It was like smokeless fireworks in a cave whose walls were lined with precious stones. But when the climax of the overture came, the music went silent for a moment. The lights went out, and when they came back on, Nartaka stood in the center of the stage. Yuri was surprised that he still thought of him as a man, although Nartaka began the dance in a female form this time. The face was impossible to see. It was shimmering and sparkling with dots of starry flame, but the figure was undeniably female, incredibly beautiful and mesmerizing. Nartaka stood with his arms slightly spread apart, his body tightly encased in the iridescent fabric of his dress. How would he dance in this? Yuri thought. But then Nartaka took a step forward. Yuri realized the dress was only an optical illusion below the waist, half hiding the legs, not restricting movement. The music rushed forward on the rolls of a complex rhythm, and Nartaka began to dance. Subsequently, it was difficult for Yuri to reconstruct the extravaganza of Nartaka's dance in detail. The great dancer flowed from one path to another as a mountain stream flows over boulders and ice flows, majestically, fiercely, smoothly, persistently. Sometimes he moved so fast that the eye did not have time to catch the movement, almost blurring from speed sometimes. Then he seemed to freeze on the spot, and only by comparing it with the images in the memory could one catch that he was still moving elusively, like a minute hand of the old mechanic watches. And he was changing shape. From a beautiful woman with a fiery glow instead of a face, he turned into a slender man dressed in coal-black tights, then again into a woman, but this time with a strange, almost triangular face. Then he became a man with an extra pair of arms. Yuri could swear he saw it. And his skin, this time wearing nothing but a loincloth, turned blue. By this point, Yuri had almost fallen into a hypnotic trance. The combination of the music of the spheres and the incredibly graceful and harmonious dance of Nartaka was taking him somewhere beyond the universe, and even the fact that the music and dance suddenly seemed to have some dark, threatening notes did not take him out of his immersion in the performance. And then suddenly, everything was cut off at once. Yuri experienced a shock. Just a moment ago, he was in the continuum of divine illumination of Nartaka's dance, and now he was sitting in complete silence and looking at the stage, where he saw two people, one of whom was lying down and the other standing over him and holding a weapon. The warp field worked as well as before, and Yuri realized that the man lying down was the dead Nartaka, and the assassin standing over him with a gun in his hand was Eric Gambino, a specialist in exotic arts. "I'm sorry for all the drama," Gambino said. They were sitting at a small cafe table in the so-called Greenhouse Complex 4, a vast continent-sized park permeated by a complex circulatory system of moving roads and paths, cafes and restaurants, artists' studios, and hotels. When the panic and chaos after Nartaka's murder had subsided, minor, really, since the majority of the audience considered it part of the intended finale, Yuri unexpectedly ran into Eric on his way out of the auditorium, and the latter suggested to go and sit somewhere. To his own surprise, And probably because of it, Yuri agreed. "Why haven't you been arrested?" he asked bluntly. "I don't know what happened there, but they should have detained you until all the circumstances are clarified. And who are you, anyway?" Gambino was silent, tapping the fingers of his left hand on the amber tabletop. "I'm really an expert in, exotic arts," Gambino finally answered. "Such as, for example, the specific dances of the late Nartaka. I followed him through a couple dozen systems before I caught up with him here. And I wasn't arrested because, of course, I didn't come here alone. The authorities are being dealt with by my colleagues, other, exotic specialists. My one and only assignment was Nartaka." "You were supposed to kill him? You're an assassin?" Gambino grinned and shook his head. "No, of course I wasn't. I was supposed to find out his goals and stop him if I had to. But couldn't you just ask? Or you just used to shoot people on sight?" The phrase sounded much harsher than Yuri would have liked, but he was overwhelmed with emotion. "Have you heard the legends of the great dance of the ancient gods?" Gambino answered a question with a question. "They are thousands of years old and come from the old earth. The legend that the gods once had a twofold dance, with its light side capable of creating worlds and its dark side capable of destroying them. Some ancient myths." Yuri shrugged. "I've heard something like that. It's not my specialty. What does it matter?" "But it is my specialty," said Gambino. "And as it turns out, it's much more real than just myths. We don't know where the Nartaka come from. Hell, we're not even sure if he's human. You've seen him change his appearance. He showed up on the edge of the galaxy 20 years ago. At least, that's as far back as we've been able to trace his past. He toured, first with a troupe, then he began to give solo performances. And with each performance, his fame and skill grew. Gradually, his personality began to grow rumors. I think you've heard them." "The usual nonsense," Yuri nodded. "Advertisements designed for primitive worlds, which, after passing through fifth hands, turn into fairy tales. Calling rain to the desert, curing the plague, that sort of thing. I've even heard a crazy story about an asteroid being pulled away from striking the orbital." Gambino nodded as he spoke. "They weren't fairy tales," he said. Yuri stared at him incomprehensibly. "I beg your pardon?" "They weren't fairy tales," Gambino repeated with a sigh. He was really doing all of these things, and with each dance, his power grew. "Don't look at me with that expression," he winked at Yuri. "I haven't lost my mind or become an adept of the holy, or divine, Nartaka. But my organization started closely monitoring him a few years ago." "Your organization?" "Well, yes, the committee of, exotic arts specialists I work for. People are accustomed, to thinking that, apart from the forces of nature, only science can pose a threat. But the arts are also very powerful. You're a man of arts, you understand. The Vayons, for example, knew that for a fact. We took him seriously after Nartaka resurrected with his dance the colonists who died of poisoning on Frazetta 4. "Wait a minute," Yuri said, thinking hard. "But you said that Nartaka devoted himself, so to speak, exclusively to the creative side of the dance. What happened here on Xanadu, and why were you so sure it had to happen?" Before answering, Gambino raised his head and looked through the dome of the force fields at the fractal weave of Xanadu's structures. The platform with the park was facing inward into the vast complex, so that the sky was always illuminated with diamond-like reflections. Only one sky sector showed a massive, colorful gas nebula framed by several multicolored stars. The nebula was called the Veil of Sleep, and was believed to be a colossal work of art, created by the Vayons. Art and creativity cannot have boundaries, or they cease to be art and creativity, he said thoughtfully. As soon as we realized that Nartaka was following the path of the twofold dance, we realized that one day he would also turn to the dark side of it. It's no coincidence that it happened here, because Xanadu is the epitome of beauty. It was only logical for absolute chaos to be born from absolute harmony. Yuri suddenly remembered the chill that had run down his spine when Nartaka's dance had suddenly taken on an ominous, horrible echo, just before the gunshot. "You mean you barely made it?" he asked. "What if you had fired just a little later? Will we all be doomed or what?" Gambino smiled sadly. "I wish it were so," he said. "What makes you think I did?" He pointed to the veil of sleep, and Yuri was horrified to see that 3 of the 9 lights at the edges of the veil had gone out, and a giant blot of coal blackness was spreading across the nebula itself. "The war between chaos and harmony has begun," said Gambino. "Do you know any prayers appropriate to the occasion?" "Only a proverb," said Yuri. "Ars longa, vita brevis." An apt saying. Gambino nodded and looked up at the sky again. "Ars longa, you say? I guess we'll find out soon enough." Imagine a dazzling jewel, a weave of diamond fractal patterns populated by the galaxy's most creative inhabitants. Art is Xanadu's very essence, the great heart of the galaxy, pumping the blood of beauty through the channels of its soul. If you fail, don't worry, for it may not matter now. For humans, blood contamination is often fatal, but who knows what results contamination of beauty will lead to. Imagine a galaxy that has become sick with chaos. If you fail again, just look around.